In the small, fog-soaked town of Black Hollow, whispers clung to the night air like an icy shiver. Those who dared to walk the narrow, winding streets after dark spoke of a strange, creeping sensation, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. But it was not just the feeling of being watched that sent chills through the spines of the townsfolk. It was the voice. Low, broken, like the remnants of a long-dead memory. It slithered through the silence and seemed to call each person by their name. It always started the same way. A soft, almost gentle murmur would drift on the wind. At first, it was so quiet that people would brush it off as their own imagination. But as the night deepened, the whisper would grow louder, sharper. It would seem to slip closer, winding around the trees, brushing past windows, slipping through the tiniest cracks in doors and windows. And then, just when the silence felt almost unbearable, it would start calling, beckoning, drawing closer to each house in its path. "Come out. I'm waiting." One dark, particularly still night, young Emmett, barely 12 years old, stood on the edge of his bed, clutching his quilt tightly as he listened. The house creaked and groaned as if breathing. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting in and out of sight, like specters caught between realms. He knew what the voice was, of course. Every child in Black Hollow had heard the stories. Parents called it the whisper of the night, an old myth. They said, something that grandparents told their grandchildren to keep them from wandering out after dark. But Emmett knew it was more than just a story. He had heard the voice before. A year earlier, his best friend Toby had vanished without a trace. He remembered Toby's face, the way he had looked the last night anyone saw him. There was a haunted look in his eyes, a tremble in his voice as he whispered to Emmett, "It's calling me. Can't you hear it?" And then he was gone. They found his room empty, his bed cold, and the only trace left behind was a single, blood-red handprint smeared across the wall by the window. No one knew what had happened. The adults said it must have been a runaway, but Emmett knew better. He had heard the whisper that night too, just before he had fallen asleep. And now, as he lay trembling in his room, the whisper had returned. "Emmett," it hissed, barely audible, like a voice pressing against the very edge of silence. "Come, Emmett." The boy's heart pounded, each beat a painful reminder that he was very much alone. He tried to shut it out, pressing his hands over his ears, but the whisper grew stronger, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. "Emmett, I'm so close." The air in his room grew colder, thick with the scent of earth and decaying leaves, as though something dead and rotting had taken root in the surrounding darkness. Shadows pulled near the foot of his bed, shifting, curling, almost alive. And then, with horrifying clarity, Emmett saw a pair of pale, glassy eyes staring back at him from the darkness. A face twisted and broken, half decayed, like a corpse that had clawed its way out of the grave. It was Toby. His once lively, laughing eyes were now sunken and empty, his skin drawn tight over his bones, gray and sagging. His mouth, twisted in a cruel grin, opened slowly, releasing a cold, rattling breath as he spoke. "It's time, Emmett," Toby whispered, his voice a sickening echo of the life he once had. "Come with me. Join me." Emmett's body froze. He wanted to scream, to cry out, but his voice seemed locked inside him. He could feel the icy tendrils of fear winding around him, paralyzing him as Toby's hand stretched out from the shadows, long, bony fingers reaching. And then, as suddenly as it began, the vision disappeared, leaving only the empty, silent darkness. But Emmett knew it wasn't over. The whisper had come for him, and in Black Hollow, once it found you, there was no escape. Emmett lay motionless in his bed, his mind reeling with what he had just seen. Toby's empty eyes and decayed smile lingered in his mind, haunting him, refusing to fade. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat sharp, cold, like the footsteps of something approaching. He didn't dare move, not even to breathe, fearing that any sound would bring the whisper closer. But as the silence deepened, he realized it wasn't just his mind playing tricks. That cold, decaying scent was still there, lingering in the air, and the whisper, it hadn't gone. It was waiting, somewhere out there, In the darkness just beyond the thin walls of his room, it watched him, waiting for him to slip, to give in, to listen just a little too closely. And then it would take him, just as it had taken Toby. The minutes crept by, each second stretching endlessly, the silence punctuated only by the slow, steady tick of his bedroom clock. But after a while, he realized something that made his blood run colder. The clock was ticking, but the shadows on his walls didn't change. The moonlight, which usually crept across his room during the night, was frozen in place. It was as if time itself had stopped. Just as this horrifying thought took root, Emmett heard it again, this time, closer. "Emmett!" The voice slithered through the silence like a blade. It was no longer faint, no longer a murmur in the distance. Now, it felt as though the whisper was right there in the room with him, seeping from the walls, surrounding him from every angle. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Emmett, come!" He gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to scream, to run, to do anything but stay frozen in place. But he knew that leaving his bed meant entering the darkness, and in Black Hollow, everyone knew that stepping into the darkness was an invitation. The shadows at the far end of his room began to shift, to stretch, almost like hands reaching out to him. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying that it would stop. But when he opened them again, the shadows had grown, thick and tangible, curling closer to his bed. Then, from within the depths of that dark, writhing mass, he saw something moving. A shape, a small, twisted figure, began to emerge. Emmett's heart lurched as he recognized the form, his worst fear made real. It was Toby again, but he looked even worse than before. His skin was peeling, hanging in shreds, exposing raw, blackened flesh underneath. His eyes, empty as pits, stared right through Emmett, and that cruel, twisted grin stretched wider as he approached. "Why did you leave me, Emmett?" Toby rasped, his voice low and wet, as if filled with soil. "You left me in the dark." Emmett shook his head, words catching in his throat, his voice strangled by terror. "Toby, I didn't." Liar," Toby hissed, his voice slicing through the darkness, sharp and bitter. "You heard me call. You heard me, and you ignored me. You let me go into the night alone." Emmett's mind flashed back to that night, the last night he had seen Toby alive. The memory was sharp, painful, a thing he had buried deep within himself to avoid facing. But now, under Toby's accusing stare, it all came rushing back. They had dared each other to go out into the woods after sunset, to see if they could find the source of the whispers. At first, it was fun, just two boys testing their bravery. But then, when the shadows had deepened, they'd both heard the whisper. Something about it had shaken Emmett so deeply that he had turned and bolted, running all the way back to town without looking back. He hadn't even checked if Toby was following him. And now here he was, back from the dead, haunting him, blaming him. "You left me," Toby growled, his broken face twisted in fury. "Now you'll come with me. Forever." A hand, cold and wet, shot out from the darkness, grasping Emmett's ankle with impossible strength. Emmett felt the icy, damp grip tighten around him, pulling him toward the edge of the bed. He kicked, fought, desperately trying to break free, but the hand only tightened, dragging him down, inch by inch, into the dark. Just as he was about to be pulled completely off the bed, a voice echoed in his mind, his grandmother's voice, whispering an old rhyme she had taught him when he was little, a charm against evil spirits. When shadows stretch and shadows crawl, speak the name, and still them all, With his heart pounding, he forced himself to remember the rhyme, focusing on the words as if they were a lifeline. His lips trembled, but he began to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Toby, Toby, I say your name, and you're gone." For a moment, everything went still. The whisper stopped, the shadows froze, and the grip on his ankle loosened. Emmett gasped, scrambling back to the center of his bed, clutching his knees to his chest, as Toby's figure seemed to flicker, his form dissolving back into the darkness. But just as Emmett thought he might be safe, Toby's voice came one last time, a faint, cruel whisper that curled around his heart. "This isn't over. I'll be back, every night, until you come with me." And with that, the shadows faded completely, and the room returned to its ordinary, empty silence. But Emmett knew that the quiet wouldn't last. The whisper of the night would return, and each night, it would get closer. 4 weeks after that terrible night, Emmett barely slept. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, his heart would sink, knowing the darkness would soon come alive with whispers. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling of the wind outside, would make him jump, his eyes darting to every shadow as if expecting Toby to emerge from the darkness again. His parents, sensing his growing fear, thought he was simply having nightmares. They gave him warm tea before bed, left his door slightly open, and even bought him a small nightlight. But Emmett knew none of it would help, not against something as relentless as the whisper of the night. One evening, Emmett decided he couldn't live in fear anymore. The memory of Toby's decaying face haunted him, a face twisted in anger and accusation, but he knew that he had to face it, to find a way to put an end to the nightmare. He could no longer bear the guilt of leaving his friend behind. That night, Emmett crept out of his house and made his way to the edge of Black Hollow Woods, the place where it all began. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out, black against the inky sky. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around his feet as he walked, as if guiding him deeper into the woods. The whispers began almost immediately, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder as he walked, surrounding him, filling his ears with words that he couldn't quite understand, but that sent a chill through his bones. And then, out of the darkness, a familiar voice drifted toward him. "Emmett!" He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the dim light filtering through the trees, he saw Toby. His form was clearer this time, as if he had grown more substantial, more real. But his eyes were still hollow, his skin still broken and gray, his mouth twisted in that terrible smile. "Toby," Emmett whispered, forcing himself to step closer. "I'm here. I came back." Toby's head tilted, as if he were considering the words. The twisted smile faded, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like sadness. "You left me, Emmett. You left me in the dark, all alone. I was afraid." Emmett swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm sorry, Toby. I was scared. I didn't mean to leave you behind." For a moment, Toby's form flickered, as if weakened by Emmett's words. But then his face twisted, and the anger returned. "Sorry isn't enough. You left me, and now you'll stay with me." With that, the shadows around Toby began to grow, stretching toward Emmett, tendrils of darkness reaching out to pull him in. Emmett stumbled back, fear clawing at him, but then his grandmother's rhyme echoed in his mind once more. Asterisk, when shadows stretch and shadows crawl, speak the name, and still them all, asterisk. But he knew that just saying the words wouldn't be enough this time. He needed something stronger, something that could break the connection between him and Toby forever. Gathering his courage, Emmett forced himself to look Toby in the eye. "I'm sorry, Toby," he said, his voice steady now, "but you're not real. You're just a shadow, a memory, and you don't belong here." The words seemed to hit Toby like a physical blow. He staggered back, his form wavering, flickering like a candle in the wind. His face twisted, shifting from anger to despair, and his voice grew faint, desperate. "No, Emmett, don't leave me, don't." But Emmett held his ground, repeating the rhyme with all the strength he could muster, forcing himself to believe it, to truly let go of the guilt that had haunted him. "Toby, I release you. Go back to the shadows. Be at peace." With a final, echoing whisper, Toby's form dissolved, fading into the fog, leaving only silence in his wake. The whispers ceased, the fog lifted, and Emmett felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold night air, realizing that the weight on his heart had lifted. The woods were silent now, filled only with the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Emmett returned home, feeling lighter than he had in months. He climbed into bed, finally free from the fear that had haunted him, and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The whisper of the night was gone, and Toby had found his rest at last.